Hello, welcome to the 10th annual Newburyport Literary Festival. I'm thrilled to introduce Joyce Maynard to you. She's a native of New Hampshire. She's known for writing very candidly about her life, and she's known for her works of fiction and hundreds and probably millions of articles, such as in the New York Times and other media. She now lives in San Francisco. She teaches workshops in Guatemala, and she'll also be teaching this summer at the Maine Media Center in Rockport, Maine. Though she's known a lot for her fiction, such as After Her and Labor Day, which just came out as a film, she's also known as writing her memoir, and that's what she'll be talking about today. She'll be talking about writing memoirs and how she goes about it, and she'll share with you her own experiences for writing memoirs. She's on Facebook, and she's also has a website, but I will tell you that after reading one of her books, you'll think of her as your friend. And maybe even when you go home today after hearing her, you'll think of her in the future as one of your friends, because she's just like that. So welcome, Joyce Maynard.
Thank you so much, Sky, and thank you all. I think I might hold the record this year for the person who came the longest way to attend your festival, and it was in total self-interest. I heard this was the most fun crowd, and that Newburyport really knows how to throw a festival, and I can see this is the case. I have to add that although I've lived in Northern California for many years now, I will be a New Englander forever, and I feel I'm cheating a little bit because I didn't suffer through the winter and I came for the spring. But I said to my husband, who is a lifelong Californian, you know, you cannot really appreciate spring without having gone through what everybody here has. And so I love it that the leaves haven't quite come out. I remember. So thank you for coming, and you know, of course I want you to read my novels, and there are plenty of them to read. Not quite millions yet of essays and columns, but probably it might be over 1,000. You're right, Sky. I have been writing full time since I was 18 years old, which means now 42 years. That's an awful lot of words. When somebody says to me, "I've read everything you wrote," I think, "Oh, please, God, no." Some people think I started writing for the New York Times Magazine. Actually, I didn't, and it wasn't 17 either. It was Humpty Dumpty. And I think there are some people in this room old enough to remember that magazine. I'm old enough to have written for it. So, although, of course, I want you to read my novels, and there are a number of them out there, I really wanted to talk today. I think that a more interesting topic, you know, what can you say about, well, there's this really interesting story, and now I'll recap it for you. I decided to talk to you about memoir today, the telling of one's story. It's what I have been all my life. I have documented just about everything that happened in my life. The one event that I'll probably not be able to get to is my death. And I am also guessing that there are some people in this room who are either engaged in writing memoir themselves or have always wanted to. And so I wanted to say some things for you as well. I'm going to begin, however, I'm a storyteller, so I'm going to begin with a story. And I'll first tell you the story, and then I'm going to tell you the story about the writing of the story, or the not writing of the story. So The year was 1997. I had at this point been writing, I hadn't yet written millions of essays, but I'd probably written thousands. I'd published a number of books. I'd told many, many stories, including some very painful ones. Stories that originally I was afraid to talk about, much less write about. I grew up in an alcoholic family, a family of dazzlingly articulate people, and the one subject never mentioned in the 18 years I lived under that roof was the fact that every night my father got drunk, and every morning we pretended it never happened. And because of that, I supposed I was the only person, I really did think I was not only the only person in Durham, New Hampshire, but the only person on the face of the earth who lived with that situation. And I lived with two kinds of shame as a result. One, the shame not of my making, but of my father's drinking, and the shame of the secret, of keeping the secret. But now it was 1997, and I had told a lot of stories. I had written about coming from an alcoholic family. I have to say, if there are people here who feel that I'm their friend, I feel as if you're my friends, and one of the great gifts of publishing my work for so long is hearing back from readers. It really was readers who lifted my sense of shame, because every time I told an honest story about my life, I got letters saying, "Me too," and I felt less alone. And less filled with shame. But there remained in 1997 one story that I had never told. It's the story that tends to be the one that people, if you Google my name, it's the one that comes to the top every time. It's actually not at all how I define myself, but it has been how I've been defined by many others for 42 years, and that's the fact that when I was 18 years old, a student at Yale, publishing my first big article in the New York Times Magazine cover story, hundreds and hundreds of letters wanting me to meet with editors, go on TV, sign book contracts. Among those letters, I received one from J.D. Salinger, who became my, I thought, friend and mentor and soulmate, but more than that as well, in his eyes and eventually mine. I dropped out of college, really dropped out of the world, gave up my full scholarship at Yale, cut off ties with just about everybody in my life, and moved in with him, imagining, as a young girl, 18 does, that I was going to be with this spiritual guide and enlightened mentor for the rest of my days. It didn't really calculate very well in my 18-year-old mind that he was 35 years older than I, but ultimately that wasn't the problem. The problem was that he really tired of me very swiftly, and 11 months later put two $50 bills in my hand and said, "Get out of my life, get your things out of my house, and never get your face again." And in the manner of an 18-year-old girl, I believed something was wrong with me. I had failed the great man. I had failed to please the great man. And I had kept that secret for 25 years. As I wrote about many, many of the struggles and rewards in my life, my marriage, my divorce, parenthood, the struggles of being a woman trying to build a career in very changing times, the deaths of my parents, there remained this one story I did not touch out of a sense of obligation to protect the great man. And I mention this is both a very particular story to me and a very universal situation for anybody who is looking at memoir. How do I protect the people who are a part of my story? And I certainly felt that obligation. And I continued to maintain my silence to the point of not even discussing what had happened, although it was huge in my life, huge and deeply painful. I never went back to college. I never discussed that, was asked regularly about it, always said, I have nothing to say, until 1997, when my daughter, the oldest of my three children, turned 18, the age that I was when everything changed in my life. And where always before I had viewed my obligation, my responsibility to protect the man in the story, when I imagined not myself, I couldn't have seen myself necessarily as worthy of protection, but when I imagined my daughter in that situation, everything changed. And I didn't feel an impulse for revenge, and I'll tell those of you who are thinking about Memoir out there, I'm really going to get him when I'm going to get my ex-husband or my stepmother or, whoever it is with my memoir. It doesn't work when you do that. It has a certain smell to it that the reader is likely to scope out. But I simply wanted to be able to tell my story. And I embarked on telling the story not simply of my life with Salinger, which is often how I'm described, a woman who wrote a book about Salinger. I actually wrote a book about me. But he had chosen to be part of my life, and I did not exclude that part from my story. And I was at work on this book, and which was not my whole story, but it was elements of my journey from then till now. And there was a very important experience that I was struggling with including or not including in my memoir. And I'm going to tell you what that was. And it actually had nothing to do with Salinger. It had to do with my ex-husband. I was by this time divorced. My children were 13, 15, and 19. And they'd lived with me long enough that they were accustomed to a fair amount of honesty and disclosure and, seeing things in the pages of magazines that other people don't talk about at the dinner table. But there had been one story that I had never told them. They knew all about Salinger. And it had to do with the night of my son Charlie's birth. And I'm going to share with you very quickly that story. I was living in New Hampshire in a little house at the end of a dead-end dirt road in a very small town. Had my daughter at home and was planning to have a home birth. It was winter. It always seemed to be winter when I was having babies. And I was 8 3/4 months pregnant. My husband was off watching a Boston Celtics game. This was in the days of Larry Bird and Kevin McHale. And suddenly the telephone rings and I get a call from the west coast of Canada that my father is dying. And he will not live through the night. There's no point talking to him. He's no longer conscious. He had gone on a bender, the big secret of our family, and he was near death with pneumonia. There was absolutely nothing to be done about it. I put down the phone and I began to shake. My body began to shake so violently that I couldn't stand up. And I sort of staggered around the room, crying and gasping for breath and trembling so violently that I lay on the bed. And actually, just to steady me, my husband lay on top of me just to sort of keep me from falling off the bed. And I was in that state, grieving my father, when all of a sudden I heard a sound come out of me that I had heard only one time in my life, and that was when I was giving birth to my daughter. And I realized I was giving birth at that moment in a house at the end of the dirt road, about 45 minutes away from where the midwife lived, and there was no waiting for her. This baby was coming now. At which point, my husband, I'm going to try really hard not to stack the deck against him in this story, has many fine qualities, said, "I think I'm going to have a smoke." It wasn't funny at the time, but I do understand. And I have to add, my husband actually didn't smoke. He was one of those people that smoked his cigarette like every 2 weeks. But that was the moment. And I said, no, we're having a baby right now. You need to be, this far away is too far away. For those in this room who've had a baby, you know. And if everything that might normally have taken 12 hours to pass by is all compacted into about 5 minutes, it's a pretty intense 5 minutes. But X was not, actually his name is well known to those who've read my work. He was not one to be told what to do. So he was going to have that cigarette. And he started to leave the room, and I actually kind of crawled after him and saying, come back. And I remember him looking at me. I was down on the floor, and he said, "Joyce, you're hysterical." And he did go out and have his cigarette and probably didn't enjoy it very much. And I held the baby in and went back to the bed. And about 5 minutes later, or however long it takes to smoke a cigarette fast, he came back in, and our son Charlie, 10-pound baby boy, just what he wanted, was born on the bed. And the next morning, my daughter came down. There was her baby brother in the bed. Everybody was celebrating. And the great story that was told in our family, and told, and I told it too, incidentally, was that Steve had single-handedly delivered Charlie. even remembered to check. He always mentioned check for the cord around the neck. He'd read the fireman's manual. And I have to tell you that story became a very bitter thing in my. It was almost as if there was bitter fruit in my mouth when I heard that story, and I felt every time a kind of betrayal. So now it's 1997. That baby is 15 years old. He's heard many stories. He's never heard that one. And I didn't want him to hear it in the pages of a memoir, but actually that story is a very important piece of my story. And everybody in this room, I want to relate my experience as a memoir writer with the stories each of you have. You have key core stories that shaped your journey, and that for me was one. That really, I remained married for a number of years after that, even had another baby, there were lots of reasons why it was a good thing to have that other baby, but I wanted to have a different kind of experience. I stayed in that marriage, but I don't think I ever again trusted my husband. And or was free from bitterness and anger towards him. And that had eventually led to the end of our marriage, as had many other things. It was a part of that story. I had begged him many times to say he was sorry, and he was not inclined to do that, and I never trusted him again. So now it's 1997, and I'm writing this book, which is not the book about Salinger, it's the book about me, and that story belonged in that book. And I thought about my children who had never heard that story, and could I put that story in that book? And I certainly knew that the place for them to learn it was not in the book as they're reading the book, if they read the book. Actually, my children are not big ones for reading my books. It's one reason I so appreciate you all. And I decided I would tell my son. I decided it was an important story. My son had been spared the pain of that story about his father, but he most certainly had not been spared the pain of the divorce and of my anger and bitterness towards his father. He knew that one well. And I found myself thinking, and there are some people in this room, again, old enough to remember those. You remember those days when you knew somebody was adopted and they didn't know they were adopted? And your parents would say, don't tell them. And I remember at the time thinking, that's not fair. I have this important information that would help them sort of understand their life, things in their life, and they don't know it. And I similarly felt at that moment, there's something that Charlie doesn't know about his own history, the very first day of his life on the planet. And I decided to tell him. And I told him in the place that parents of teenagers probably have the best luck having difficult conversations, in the car. On a highway, Route 101, driving north, driving him to school. It was the last months that I still was driving him to school. He couldn't get out, but I had to be staring straight ahead. I couldn't be looking at him. He couldn't jump out. And I tell him this story in the flattest, most non-judgmental way. Charlie, remember that? Incidentally, I neglected an important part. As a storyteller, I'm kicking myself. My husband watched the end of the Celtics game. That's how quickly everything. I'm not blaming him for that. They were a great team, but I'm just saying it all happened that fast, and they won. So I'm telling him, I said, Charlie, remember that, night about, how your dad delivered you? There's some things that you don't know. And I told him very simply, and I had this knot in my stomach. Oh my God, I'm finally telling this difficult, shameful truth, this painful thing that, how is my son going to live with this? And when it was over, my son kind of chuckled, and he said, well, that sure sounds like Dad. And he loves his dad. P.S. He loves his dad. And he doesn't love his dad because he thinks his dad is the best person to give birth alone in a house at the end of a dead-end road in Hillsborough, New Hampshire without a midwife. But he loves his dad. He knows him and loves him for who he really is and who he is to him. And that's much more solid ground than some illusion that he's the big baby-delivering hero. And I put that story in my memoir, and it was okay. And interestingly, although that was the one that I so suffered over telling, there were some stories about my mother that were pretty tough too, and I adored my mother, but I made my mother a human, flawed character, a deeply flawed character. And it's interesting, when people read At Home in the World, I often say, well, what did you think about my mother? She did crazy, damaging, disastrous things. She didn't know where she stopped and I began. She sewed a little girl dress for me to go and meet Salinger in. She really made huge mistakes, as do we all. And there are no villains in our lives, as far as I'm concerned. There are human characters with human flaws and damage, and it is the job of a writer of memoir, to recount those. But when I ask people how they felt about my mother, they always say, wow, what a spectacular woman. They didn't have to have her for a mother, but she sure did teach me how to write, and many other things too. So when the book came out, nobody mentioned my potential violation of my ex-husband, my mother. Everybody talked about how I had betrayed the privacy of the great man. And if you were reading book reviews in the fall of 1998, you would have been hard-pressed to find a reviewer who didn't condemn not just that book, but me very personally. The Washington Post called it the worst book ever published. The New York Times, Maureen Dowd had an editorial about Joyce Maynard and her big mouth. And the view was out there, and I wish I could say it's totally absent now. It's not. That it is the responsibility, specifically often of women, to keep the secrets of more important men. And even certain feminists weighed in that I was portraying myself as a victim, but an 18-year-old was fully in charge of her life. The publication of that book really changed my life. It might have been, Time magazine said, the one good thing about At Home in the World is now that Joyce Maynard has told this story, we will never have to hear from Joyce Maynard again. And that actually was a very helpful thing to hear, because I was going to prove that wrong. And the suggestion that that story of something that happened when I was 18 was the only story I had, please. So I think that was about 6 novels ago, and it's actually one of the reasons why I so believe in writing memoir and reading memoir. Writing memoir because it frees you of the stories that haunt us and allows us to go on and build new stories. They don't pull us back and keep us silent anymore. And then we can put them up on the shelf, which is what I've done with that story. But one of the things, it did not destroy, it had a pretty big damage to my career. And for many years, I was untouchable. I had no publisher, I had no agent. Really not until my novel Labor Day was I able to support myself as a writer again. And I remember always, when I take a stage, I remember a day that year when I took a stage to speak at a conference of very big, very famous writers were there. And as I took the stage to speak about At Home in the World, this is 1998, an entire row of very well-known writers, you would know their names, got up en masse and walked out of the room. So they never heard what I had to say. But I will say, having said that, I will say that I have not, for one day, 1 hour, regretted the telling of that story for what it has done for me, both personally and for my authenticity as a writer. I lived the life of an honest woman, having written that book. So, and one of the things that I started to do was to teach memoir. I felt, who better equipped to address the fears that people have in approaching the telling of their story than somebody who has dealt with them in a pretty harsh way and come out the other end. So I made a list of 10 reasons why people say, oh, I couldn't write a memoir. And I'm going to name them. I always look forward to the question part, and I want to get to that just as quickly as we can here today. But first, I'll raise myself what some of the questions are, just to make sure we name them. Why should anyone care about my life? I never did anything extraordinary. As if the only reason to tell one story or to read a person's story is if they've climbed Mount Everest, blind, deaf, and dumb, or were related to a very famous movie star. No. Think about the stories that you have loved. Frank McCourt, Mary Carr. They are the stories of people like us, telling the stories of so-called ordinary life. And what I know is that no life is an ordinary life. And there are no two stories in this room the same. Number 2, well, okay, I did have some extraordinary things happen in my life, but it would be so embarrassing to tell them. To which I say, and I feel I really have a right to say this, I have told the most potentially embarrassing stories in print, and I have lived to be here with you today. And the question I suggest you ask yourself is, what is the worst thing that can happen? I will always remember a time I spoke to it was a group of kids. It was a middle school book that I'd written, and somebody was asking how I'd come up with a particular character, and I said, well, there's this kid, and it was a room full of 7th graders. 7th graders can be pretty cruel, pretty tough. I said, there's always one kid in the class that's just kind of, he sits alone in the cafeteria, and he dresses kind of funny, and I don't know where I pulled this out of, but because it wasn't true of the character I wrote, and I said, maybe he drools. And a boy in the very far back didn't even raise his hand, he said, I drool. And then he started talking. He said, I try not to. I don't know why I do it. It's so embarrassing. I feel so bad. And people make fun of me. And he did this whole thing on drooling at the back of the room. And we all just stood there. And I said, wow, we have just heard from the bravest person in this room. The person who could name his flaws before anybody else named them of him. He now took control by saying it himself. And I said, and now will all the people who are perfect, who have no embarrassing problems of their own, please leave the room. And you know how many people left the room. My favorite adjective applied to At Home in the World was shameless. It was said in almost every review. Joyce Maynard is shameless, 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 shameless. Well, thank you very much. What a wonderful way to live. Okay, number 3. Writing memoir is so self-involved. It's all about me. And then really nice, selfless people add, but my grandfather did all these really interesting things. I could write a book about him. I have a dear friend and longtime occasional writing student in this room who spent 10 years trying to write a book about her uncle, who was so fascinating. And she's fascinating, as I always tell her. So what about it's so self-involved? Well, yes, it is the only life that you truly have full access to. I have absolutely no business writing a book about Salinger, nor do I have a right to write a book about my ex-husband, or my children, or my mother. The only story I can tell is mine, and it is not the story, it is my story. I happen to come from a family of such writers that 3 of us have published memoirs. My mother, my sister, and I have all written memoirs in which a major character is my mother. And you know what? We're not done yet. My daughter hasn't checked in. And every one of them is a different story, and they're all true. There is no one truth. There is your truth. Number 4. Well, there are so many books about breast cancer, incest, rape, suicide of a person in the family, or very simply just being me in the year 1960. Well, yes, there are so many books about all those topics, but it is not your experience. And it's ultimately what a good memoir does is not explore breast cancer or suicide or incest. It is your experience of those things. And however, I don't care if it's Andre Dubus or Anne Hood or me, we can't tell that story as well as you can. Only you can tell your story. I can't possibly remember everything. This is number 5. Thank God, is what I say. Your memoir is not the story of every single thing that happened in your life. And there are people who get so hung up on the research, they never get to the writing. They have stacks and stacks of family archives and journals and letters. And as long as they have those, they don't have to sit down and write. Guess what? The stories that are the most important stories, you don't have to research, you just know. I didn't have to think up, were there any interesting stories that happened to me around March of 1982 when I was giving birth? Well, I knew that one because it was a core story. You know your core stories. But if you need to jog your memory a little bit, and I was surprised at how much came back when I did this, play the music that you listen to. Smell the smells that you listen to. I actually buried my face in my mother's clothes after she died. I just wanted to bring her back. Number 6, My childhood was too happy. Oh, poor you. But I will say, you can overcome this challenge. This may be the most difficult one, but I think if you take a workshop from me, I'll find some trouble. And actually, it's wonderful to hear about a happy childhood. One of my all-time favorite memoirs is Russell Baker, Good Times. Because there's so much of the other. It's very refreshing. And there's nothing like well-told happiness. If I start getting into my story, I might feel too sad. Well, that is true. You will. I cried and cried and cried when I wrote At Home in the World. I actually left home to write At Home in the World. I didn't want to be around my children while I was revisiting some of those experiences. And this is a very personal choice, but my goal in life is not always to feel comfortable. My goal in life is to fully know my life, my one life that I get, and that when I die, I will know what my life was. I want to go to those dark places, and the good news is that having visited them, you come out the other end. Number 9, I keep getting rejection letters. I don't have an agent. I hear this a lot at my memoir workshops. And although these are problems, I will say to every writer who has said that, I know why you get rejection letters, because you need to work more on your manuscript. That's just a little PS in my listings to say that a lot of memoir writers are working on the selling of the memoir before they're fully exploring the writing of the memoir. And I am an impossible optimist, but I actually believe when you do your writing really well, I am now speaking to the writers in the room, when you write really well, those other things will take care of themselves, but spend your energy on the writing. And finally, if I tell the truth, I'll never get invited to Thanksgiving dinner again. I always say to my students, write as if you were an orphan. Easy for me to say, I am an orphan. And I have been an orphan since I was quite young. I was 35 when my mother died, and my father died when I was 27. But actually, I believe it is important, whether or not you are an orphan, whether you are married or have children, that you write thinking about none of them. Thinking about none of them. You have paid dearly for the experience of being you all these years, and our freedoms are curtailed in so many ways in this life and on this planet. Let there be one place where you experience pure and total freedom, and that is on the page. And it doesn't require that you have lots of money or a fancy desk or office or the latest writing program. It requires only you alone with your laptop or even just your pencil and paper. Do not deny yourself that freedom because you feel you have to protect your mother. I adored my mother, but did my mother protect me so well? Not necessarily. It is the place. And if you are not prepared to do that, then don't ask me to read your memoir. Don't ask me to plunk down $25 and 12 hours of my life reading what is fundamentally not a fully honest story. But more than your responsibility to me, it's your responsibility to yourself to know the telling of the real story. And I can't answer for you the particular issues that each of us has, and they're all different about, I'm working right now with a writer who says, I won't get my inheritance if I publish this book, and her inheritance is significant. I know nothing of that kind of problem. But I will say to her, whatever she ultimately decides, maybe she has to change something somewhere, I doubt that that's going to work, or wait for some people to die. Know the experience. It's a nice problem to have, incidentally, that your book gets published, so you have to worry about this. The act of writing is hard enough without adding into the mix, what is my mother going to think? What are my children going to think? Oh, they're going to find out I had sex. Oh, they're going to find out I took drugs. Oh, they're going to find out that I once tried to kill myself. And what's the worst that can happen? I could go on a lot longer, but honestly, the gift for me is hearing from you. So I'm sure you're not going to be shy, and go to it. I would love, yes!
Well,
hello.
How much did you love Tina Fey's memoir, Bossy Pants?
Oh, I have to tell you, I haven't read all of it. I've read excerpts, but there is a shameless woman. And in fact, comedians know this already. Think about Joan Rivers. Think about, the brave women who get up and name the things. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Are you Bob?
I'm Jim.
You're Jim. Okay, I thought I knew you from somewhere. Excuse me.
Not yet.
Yeah, well, you're one of my friends, Yeah. Yes. The question was, how much did I love Tina Fey's memoir? And I'll say a lot. A lot. Yes.
So, one, you're an amazing person. I just want to thank you for so thoughtful and still making me think about a lot of things in a lot of ways. So thanks for doing that for all of us. My one question was, when you were talking about that point with your husband, that turning point,
Yes.
just tell me, if you feel comfortable, what did you learn from that? How did you apply that to your life now?
Such a good, it's funny, I've never been asked that question. What did I learn from that experience with my husband? Well, one thing that I would not have known at the time, I was 28 when that happened, is that everybody has their story. And were he to write a memoir, and I think it's unlikely that he will, he would have his, if he were able to sort of look deeply and truthfully at that, he was probably terrified. I suspect he was terrified. That's why he needed a cigarette, What I learned is that bitterness does not serve us well. And I paid dearly for that lesson because I was bitter and angry for many years. And when I look at my early writing about my divorce, I don't like it. I think I was finally able to write better. I know when I was able to write better about divorce. I wrote a novel called The Usual Rules, in which there's the character of a 13-year-old girl who is the daughter of divorced parents, and she listens to her mother railing about her father. And I imagined, the daughter is not my daughter Audrey, but I imagined the experience of the child of a divorced parent listening to the divorced parent, and that was very helpful. I do not want to be an angry woman. I mean, I can be angry at many things that are going on in the world, but I don't want to be in my personal relationships. I don't want to take it there. Yeah.
Yes, earlier this year I was together with three of my siblings. My father had just passed away, and we were all remembering when and talking away. And there were a number of stories that had come up that we were sharing in the Christmas of 1970 in Toronto and that sort of thing. And what struck me is the even some of what one would consider to be the hard facts, furniture, content in the room, and so forth, we couldn't agree on.
Yes.
And so it seemed, on some very real level, it seemed like there almost wasn't any facts. It was all stories. All of us were filtering our memories were all being filtered through our own experience, our own feelings, and so on.
I hope everybody can hear this, ma'am, because I would say exactly that. There is not the truth. There is your truth.
Our story.
Yes.
Right, and so it just seems tricky to find a place where you can stand in a very kind of firm way. And I was thinking when you were talking about some of your experiences with and your ex-husband and so on, what was running through my mind at the time, and I haven't read your work, and I'm not commenting on your work.
Mm-hmm.
But what was running through my mind is good journalism has fact checkers and they have editorial control and so on. And I just wonder, it just seems like to write a fair memoir, you need to also represent, it seems to me, the characters in your story who have a whole context and a whole experience that is different from yours. And it just seems like it could be risky to characterize.
Oh, I have so much to say. I'm just. Memoir, did everybody hear the question? It could be risky, it's not fair, there aren't fact checkers. What about the other person's point of view? All true. I actually think Salinger would have been able to get a book contract to write about his experience with me, were he to have wished that. And that's obviously a tongue-in-cheek remark. When you, as a reader, read a memoir, I think you know that. I think you are not reading biography. You are not reading history. You are reading the point of view. And in fact, it would be presumptuous of me to inject into my memoir, presumptuous and inadequate, what I thought was going on in the eyes of Salinger, my mother. I have lots of theories about why he wrote to me and to many 18-year-old girls over the years, I came to learn. I did not say this. I did not interpret. I did not become his therapist. I did not say, my mother was a 50-year-old woman who'd been denied her own career. She was, her marriage was failing. She sees this great writer writing to her daughter, and she kind of thinks this is the validation of her many years of raising me to be this person who will attract his attention. All true. I don't say that. I confine myself to what I saw and leave it to the great wisdom and perception of the reader to make of it what he or she will. And I'll tell you again, from 42 plus years of publishing my work, huge respect for the perception of the reader, the ability of the reader to do that. There's a scene in At Home in the World. Well, it's interesting. My love and devotion and sort of worshipfulness towards this man was formed during a correspondence that was very intense, lasted for a period of only a few months, but for those few months, every day, I went to the Yale post office and kind of got a letter from Holden Caulfield telling me I was the most wonderful girl in the world. That's, a lot for a girl in a small town who comes from a small town in New Hampshire or anywhere. And I was not legally allowed to quote any of what was said in those letters. And there actually is a law on the books that very clearly states, it's a precedent set by Salinger's attorneys, in fact, years before I wrote my book, that clearly states, if I send you a letter, you own the physical document of the letter, but the words are mine. And if you want to quote me, I probably won't sue you. But Salinger, you might not want to risk it, and my publishers didn't. So I was given this huge challenge of telling that story without using that extraordinarily funny, unique, seductive, not sexually seductive, these really weren't sexual letters, but language. But what I could do, and what you'll see on page probably like 125 of that memoir, should you read it, and I really recommend you do, because not just because I want to sell a book, I actually think it will address your question, but you'll see an entire conversation that we had recreated. We were taking a walk in Cornish, New Hampshire, and he's giving me advice about writing. As you're reading those pages, I did not have a tape recorder in my pocket, nor was I taking notes. I didn't think I'd ever write about this because I was going to live with him forever, and he forbade me to ever speak of him and didn't even like the writing idea very much. So as you're reading this, that this is a reconstruction. And I could have had him say just anything I wanted. I could have had him say, Joyce, over the years you're going to publish lots of books, and I really recommend that people in places like Newburyport, Mass. Always buy them. I didn't put that in the book. And I do stand by that dialogue very closely, but his voice is still in my head 40 years later, and I had those letters that I could read and sort of draw from for his vocabulary and rhythms and language and all his writing. But you, as an intelligent, perceptive reader, also recognize that I'm reconstructing. I don't even need to say it. You get that. My sister's also a writer, and a very fine writer in Canada. And one time, a few years ago, a magazine gave us a wonderful assignment. Well, I suggested the assignment, actually, that each of us write about being the sister to the other. And we must not consult with each other, which wasn't hard to do because we actually don't talk a whole lot. I love my sister, but we're very, very far apart in lots of ways. We each wrote a piece, told many of the same stories as you had that same experience, completely different. And actually, the wonderful thing, and one of the reasons why I so believe in memoir, is that it was the publication of those two essays, the reading of each other's essays, that brought my sister and me together. And we have been much closer ever since. I saw her perspective. She saw mine. We wrote about the bitterest, hardest moment of our relationship, which was the death of our mother. And it brought us together, which is everything about why I believe in doing this, why I so believe in memoir. I see the time, and so as much as I could talk with you forever, I'm going to close, but I wanted to close with a very short little passage from At Home in the World. It's not written by me, actually. It's written by my son, Will, who is now 31, but he was 14 at the time. And the background is that I was getting a whole lot of letters coming in telling me what a terrible person I was to have published at home in the world and told these stories. And they were one was coming into my website that used to have this sort of little interactive feature where people's letters appeared. And my son, believe me, had many better things to do in his mind than read my website. But he happened to see this one letter, and he said, "Mom, do you mind if I just respond to that?" And he sat down at the computer, and this is what he wrote. And I will close with this. 14-year-old Will. Oh, Kathy. I love it, not dear Kathy. Oh, Kathy. I have read my mother's most recent book, and though parts were hard to hear, I was glad to read every page of it. I am sure that in your own life, you too have been faced with adversity and pain that affected you profoundly, as has my mother. The fact that she chose to express hers in writing is, I believe, a sign of her strength and an expression of the faith she has in her children. Yes, I do. I am the youngest of my siblings and possibly the, quote, least mature. However, not for a moment do I suspect any conflicting feeling from my fellow siblings when I say that we all love and support our mother despite her zany stories of despair and woe. I think that we can all relate and learn from these tales if they are approached with an open mind and, in my case, a little love. Sincerely, Stephen Wilson Bethel. Thank you so much. I would love to sign your books, and I'd love it if you give my novels a try. But At Home in the World is my prescription for you.